Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi, Antonia and Joel. My question is, are highly sensitive persons connected to personality types? I found quite frequently that INFJs, like me, are highly sensitive persons, even though I think I know someone who isn't, and that INFPs are as well. But I also think I know some of that type who aren't. These sites suggest, without much proven data, that highly sensitive persons are from all personality types, but are most likely from INFJs and INFPs. My question is if you have any perspective on how this interacts with personalities and how it would present itself in different types, and why they are more common in the INF types. I'm trying to map those systems of personality studies in my brain to one cluster, but I don't find many overlapping points to do this myself. Do you have any thoughts on the topic? Have a really good day, Caroline.
So I think the first thing that we need to do is define what a highly sensitive person is. And we're not talking about people who are easy to offend. Like if you mention the term highly sensitive person to the layman, they're probably going to think you're talking about somebody who's like got a hair trigger. Yeah,
easily triggered. You can offend them. You say the wrong thing, and now they're going to be mad at you for like 2 weeks and not talk to you.
Right. So that's not what is intended to be implied with the phrase a highly sensitive person. This has become more of a co-opted technical term. And in fact, it's becoming actually sort of a movement, almost like you're seeing online a massive introvert movement. I don't know if you guys have noticed this or if you've noticed this, but you'll see articles about introverts all over the place. Yeah. And I think it's because, you know, there's a segment of the population that has felt sort of underserved in general. And I think highly sensitive person, or HSP, is how it's usually written out, is a portion of the population that probably doesn't feel like they've been acknowledged as much as they could be. So this is not just somebody who's like got a hair trigger for offense. This is actually like a term that indicates two things, really. The first is a highly sensitive person that's sensitive to stimuli, like sensory stimuli, noises, lights, that sort of thing. So their senses get assaulted very easily. And the other kind of highly sensitive person is somebody who is sensitive to basically the emotional environment around them. They're sensitive to other people's, you could call it psychic garbage. And so you've got two categories of a highly sensitive person, somebody who's sensitive to stimuli and another person who's sensitive to the emotional, you know, sort of the feeling of the room, the ambiance of the room. And so if you've got two different categories, you're going to have different type correlations. And I do believe that there are type correlations here in the Myers-Briggs system. I do think that certain personality types have a tendency to be HSPs in either HSP1, which is sensory stimuli, or HSP2, which is emotional sensitivity. And of course, there's going to be people who have crossover, certain personality types that will have a tendency to be sensitive to both. Again, I use the word tendency because I don't think it's necessarily across the board. I don't think every person of a certain personality type is going to necessarily be a highly sensitive person in either of these two categories. It's just you're going to have a higher degree of likelihood. So let's take the first category. The first category is somebody who's sensitive to stimuli, to sensory stimuli. And I would say that anybody who has the cognitive function of extroverted sensing, or what we call sensation, as sort of low in their what we call the cognitive function stack, or in our model of the car model, like a backseat passenger, or maybe even a shadow process, a function that's not even in their car. These are people who are more likely to be highly sensitive to sensory stimuli because it's not something they've focused on building as a tool. They're not as in touch with their bodies. That's not something that's not something that they're building higher and higher levels of tolerance to. And so the people who are the most likely to be highly sensitive people are people who are like the intuitive judgers in the Myers-Briggs system. Anybody who's an NJ, and in particular an INJs have the sensation process as the 3-year-old in the back of their car. So that means that it's what is technically called an inferior process for them. So if it's inferior, it means it's something that's sort of unconscious for them. They're not really thinking about it. And a lot of sensory stimuli is going to be overwhelming to their senses. I know an INTJ that literally fell asleep at a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert. Like, a Chili Peppers concert, right? Like, how massively stimulating can you get than a Chili Peppers concert? And they just were overwhelmed by all of it, and it basically shut down their entire body, and they fell asleep. So an INTJ is not somebody who you would think, would be somebody who's really super sensitive to other people's emotional energy. They might have a sensitivity to it if they're in a relationship with that person. But just in general, you're not thinking of INTJs as being particularly sensitive to like sort of the emotional juju of the room. And yet they could be very overstimulated easily by, through their sensation process. So that's a person, an INTJ. An INFJ is also probably going to fall in that category. I could see people who maybe are introverts in general that would fall into the category of being overstimulated by sensory input in the outside world if there's somebody who doesn't venture out too much and hasn't really built skill in that sensation process. On the other hand, people who are sensitive to sort of emotional juju, right? I keep calling it juju, but it's like sort of the emotional environment or other people's emotional energy, their psychic garbage, that sort of thing. That is going to be most likely the province of feelers in the Myers-Briggs system. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily just introverts. I could totally see ENFJs being, highly sensitive people because they're picking up other people's emotional, stuff as well. I could see lots of different feeling types being highly sensitive people in that category. But I would say that the most likely types that are going to be sensitive in that way are going to be introverts that are also feelers. So I could see ISFPs falling in that category, INFPs. I could see ISFJs falling in the category of being highly sensitive people when it comes to that emotional interaction. So I wouldn't just say it's the INFs. I would say any introvert that's a feeler. And then probably the intuitive feelers would also fall into that category oftentimes. So it's... What's tough about this is that it's not going to be a one-to-one equation. It's not going to be, if INFJ, absolutely highly sensitive person in an emotional way, or if an INTJ, absolutely a highly sensitive person in a sensory way. It's not going to be a one-to-one correlation, but you are going to see trends pop up, and it's going to be about the cognitive functions the person uses. All the feeling types use a cognitive function, a decision-making process, either introverted or extroverted feeling, which we call harmony or authenticity, that by definition makes decisions based on how things are impacting people on an emotional level. So they're thinking about emotions all the time. That makes them highly sensitive to other people's emotional states because that's the criteria they're using to make decisions. That's what they're evaluating to enter the world. So those people they're going to have emotions more on their radar. They're going to build higher skill in reading other people's emotional experience. And so they're going to have a tendency to be more in tune with it. Now, whether or not that's hitting them in a way that makes them sensitive is going to be based on their maturity levels, their skill development, how their feeling process shows up for them. A very undeveloped ISFP may be a highly sensitive person, and a very, very developed ISFP might not be a highly sensitive person. Whereas an INFJ might be highly sensitive their whole life, regardless of their level of development. So it's really... What makes the trend difficult is that, again, it's not a one-to-one ratio. It's going to show up a little differently per type, and it's just a matter of playing around with it. If you're trying to create sort of a list of which types are going to fall into which categories, that might be something you're going to have to do through your own tested rate and your own observations. But those are the trends that I would see. Is somebody, again, HSP1, which are people who are sensitive to stimuli, anybody who's using that sensation process as an inferior or something that they're not really working on at all. And then people who are HSP2, which are people who are emotionally sensitive. It's going to fall in a level of categories as to how much they're letting other people impact them emotionally, their levels of development, and how they're using or utilizing those feeling processes.
Thank you, Caroline, for the question. And are you a highly sensitive person? If you're listening, have you categorized yourself as one of those two types of highly sensitive persons? Leave us some comments under this PHQ and let us know what are some of the strategies you've dealt with this in your life. How have you gone about your world? Are there ways that you are seeing this pop up for you? Have you noticed types that this shows up for?
Yeah, and if you're a person who deals with especially the second way that we defined highly sensitive person, sort of that emotionally highly sensitive component, we wrote an article on the Personality Hacker blog called Using the Chakras to help with being a highly sensitive person. And I would just, go to our blog and maybe in the search field put chakras, and what that article will pop up. And there's a couple really great exercises that you can utilize in order to get your center back and, just really kind of deal with being a sensitive person, but having tools so that it doesn't overwhelm you, but you can actually utilize it as a skill that will help other people.
You can find this PHQ, all sorts of articles, and our main podcast over at personalityhacker.com. Also join us on our growing community at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk to you on the next PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community.